Hi, everybody. We are on week 5, 1 week left, and I really hope that you've enjoyed this class as much as I've enjoyed you. I know it's been really difficult because for your discussions and posts, there's only, a small group of you. Feel free to get to that 4 by writing twice on any one of the person's or my discussion. You can do that. So this week we're going to discuss women. This is going to be historically criminal justice has been viewed as a male-dominated field. That's a fact. To this day, it's still viewed as a male-dominated field. And I will tell you, it is not easy for women in law enforcement at all. And a lot of it has to do with what traditional roles are. And traditional roles continue on, believe it or not. We're going to go over a little bit of that. And I thought that I would do, since women in criminal justice really started in my era, started in the, early 70s and in the 80s became even a bigger explosion, an explosion of less than like 12% are women in law enforcement to this day, that I would go over my history because my history has been important to people on my job, and my friends' history has been important to their job, and I'll explain that as I go. So in 1974, I went to my guidance counselor. My father was one of those that said, "You will take care of yourself." I was one of 6 girls and 1 boy. He says, "You girls are all going to college, so if something happens in your life, you take care of yourself. You get to kick whoever hurt you to the curb, or if something happens to that person, you always know you have a job. You always know that you have something to take back." And so it was always understood you go to college. So figure it out what you want to do, but you got to do it. So in 1974, I went to see Mrs. Robinson. It's funny how you remember those names. And I said, "Mrs. Robinson, what can I take in college that I don't have to take math? Because I hate math and I don't want to take any math. I don't want to take any more math. I'm so done with math." And she said, "Honey," she called me honey, "honey, I'd say law enforcement, but you can't do law enforcement because that's for men." And I'm like, "Well, who says I can't do law enforcement?" She goes, "Well, you can't. Only men are police officers." And I'm like, "Well, nobody told me I can't, so I'm going to do that." My parents were like very encouraging and said, "Pick a choice." I will tell you that that changed a little like 8 years later, but I said, "Okay, law enforcement it is." So I enrolled into criminal justice in college. I was the only female in my class. And there was nobody that was even coming up the ranks behind that. Being one of 7 kids, all of us had to work. So I went to work at Bay State West, which was owned by Mass Mutual. I went to work as a security officer. And I and another person got hired at the same day. He got hired at $160 more a week than I did. So I saw that our job descriptions were the same. I saw that our jobs were exactly the same. And we worked exactly the same shifts and had to do exactly the same work. So I asked the director about 3 months into it, I said, "Why does he make $160 more a week than I do?" And he said, "Well, it's because you have the female position and he has the male position." I went, "Okay, that's not going to work. I think you really need to rethink that. This is 1974. We need to move forward on this." And he didn't agree with that, so I had to take it to the Mass Commission Against Discrimination, who sided with me about much, much later. I didn't get any back pay, but I did get promoted into the $160 more a week male position. And the only good I got out of that is he was let go by Mass Mutual because he really was so careless in being, discriminatory. Very, very careless. Um, so moving forward on that, along the line, I took a civil service test. And in the civil service test, I did very well, and I stood in line and I took it for the state police and local police. And I passed both, and I got called for both. And I sit there and I think to a state trooper who said to me during that time period, he says, "You don't want to work for the police, so you don't want to work for the state police because you know what? They're going to have you be doing all the prostitution stuff, and then you're going to have to like prostitute yourself, and you're going to have to sell yourself." And I'm like, "No, I am not." He goes, "Oh, yes, you are." And he was being very sincere about this. And I laugh about that with him now because I see him every so often. I'm saying, no, not once in my career did I have to sleep with anybody for the job. I just want you to know that. And that was what he kept saying to me. "You're going to have to do that. And if you don't, that's what they're going to ask you to do." Well, they didn't, and I didn't. So I want to tell you that was lie number one. But I decided to go with the local police because I didn't want to do what the state police were doing at the time. They were doing all Chapter 90, which is all motor vehicle. My girlfriend went with the state police at the same time. So we had dueling, I wouldn't say dueling because we were closest of friends. We had dual careers. We followed each other. And along the lines, 1985, well, prior to 1985, I got hired on the Westfield Police Department. And the interview went, we all stood in line outside this closed door room. It was the roll call room at the police department. And I was the fifth one. I was not considered, I didn't have any minority status, and I didn't have any benefits from being in the service. So I got the highest mark on the test that didn't have any benefit added to it or any points added to it. So I was the fifth one. And I was really happy to be in that fifth position. They were hiring 10 people. And they all got in there. The 5 people before me, the 4 people before me got in there, did their 10-minute interviews. I went in and mine was like an hour and 15 minutes long. And the first question that was asked out of the female police commissioner's mouth was, I see you're planning to get married here, because that was on my sheet that they had. I said, I am. And they said, well, who's going to make your husband's breakfast? And I started laughing. I said, well, I'm going to have to hit this with some humor. I said, well, first of all, I wouldn't marry anybody that doesn't know how to make his own breakfast. That's number one. And number two, if he can't figure out how to make his own breakfast, then he's going to have to figure out what McDonald's is, because I'm not his mother. She took offense to that. And I was like, But I got hired, and I ended up going on the police department, and I worked until 1985 when I was now working 4 to 12 in uniform. And I was married now, and became pregnant. And my son was, I went in and told my chief that I was pregnant, and he was mad as could be. And then very shortly later, I got a notification from the bank that my mortgage was being terminated. And they said, the reason I called up, and I said, what's the reason for my mortgage being terminated? I've never been late a day. What is the purpose for that? And they said, well, the reason being is because you no longer have a job. So what do you mean I no longer have a job? And they said, we have paperwork here stating that you've been terminated. So I got the paper, went to the bank, got the paperwork, brought it to my chief and said, it says here I'm terminated. He says, that's right, you are. I said, I'm coming on at 4 o'clock this afternoon. And he says, no, you've been terminated. You'll be terminated after this baby because you need to stay home with your children. And it was so infuriating. I said, I have no intention of staying home with my children. Um, I plan on working. And the reason I plan on working is because, one, my lifestyle, two, my mortgage, three, I had figured that all in. It wasn't his business to figure out whether I was going to be a mother or not, whether I could juggle it all or not. He said, well, you need to stay home with your children. I went down and I saw my captain, who was a really, really good guy, and he says, I'll get this worked out, so not to worry. But I had to get an attorney, and it took a while, but I had to get an attorney, and they agreed to let me stay to work as long as one, I got a note every 10 days from the doctor saying I could do the duties of the job, because on a police department, there is no such thing as light duty. Fast forward, I took 2.5 weeks off. I worked the last day of my son's birthday was the 23rd of December, and I worked that morning. I had a court case. I was actually working the Fort Patrol, but I had a court case, and I had my son. I went in and I had my son, and took 2.5 weeks off and went back to work. I figured somewhere along the line that this would end, that this wouldn't be the same. Well, my girlfriend had the same issue, and she was with the state police, and she had to take it to court as well. 2 weeks before she had her daughter, the court ruled on her behalf, and what ended up happening is they put her back on the street wearing a gun belt 2 weeks before she had her daughter. I should also tell you that I also thought my department was being very progressive. I was the only female for 8 to 10 years. Uh, like 3 weeks after I got out of the police academy, they sent me to rape school, only to find out that the law says that you have to train a female to be a rape investigator if they're on the job. You must have at least one. I ended up, when I came back from having my son, and they put me in as a juvenile officer. And that lasted all of about 3 weeks, because I said, I am not going to be pigeonholed into this. Although I have to be honest with you, it was a job that I truly loved. And then I decided, then they put me in. After that, I said, I'm leaving. I'm opting out. And they asked me to stay. And what is actually happening was another detective I work with says, I have absolutely no intention of doing any more unattended deaths. The new detective can get them. That would have been me. So for the next probably 10 years, I did every unattended death there was. I was like, man, I went from being juvenile officer to in charge of all the unattended deaths. We joke about that now, but I want to tell you that it's a very hard job for women. And women leave this job at a very quick rate, but it was still the best job I could ever have for me. It worked out beautiful for me. I loved it. It allowed me to meet many people, many really wonderful people, and help a lot of wonderful people. I can't tell you that every day was easy because it wasn't. I've had people who've written suicide notes to me and say they, killed themselves because of my actions of arresting them. But I thought that I was very cautious over everything that I've done, and I didn't. I mean, that bothers you, but you realize you do your job, you do it right, things happen. Uh, I want to tell you that all of you I know are going into some form of criminal justice here. They need you. They need you because women typically handle law enforcement much different than men. But I also want to tell you that most of all of this changed, and it's evolving still. Most of all of this changed in the late 70s, early 80s. And when you look at this, if you look at the history of women in law enforcement, you'll see that. And so there's jobs that are out there. Don't think because they were male dominated that that doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you can do it. 1968, two women with the first woman, and you're not going to see that on this sheet, but this 1968, Indianapolis, first two women to ever do patrol. I could not be proud of those two women. And for the most part, they were forced to work together because men didn't want to work with them. But you know what? They were great police officers. In 1998, I was named police officer for Hampden County. It had nothing to do with my gender. It had to do with my work ethic. And people recognize that. So you be the one out there to be recognized. You be the one to go out there and just keep doing your job and don't let people, drag you down. Do what you feel is right. I have to tell you also, I'm just like some of you going back to school. After I had my daughter in 1989, I decided to get my master's. And guess what they made me take? I had to do math as science. Now, it was horrible. But I had a sister who was a math teacher. She got the entire gene pool from math from my family. And so she tutored me every week on how to do math. So go to your sisters and ask for help. That's what you're there for. You're there to help each other. Uh, I also want to tell you when you look at these, I'm going to send these to you. I want you to look at something that I think is just horrible. 2004, the first Asian American woman to become a police chief. 2004. That should never happen. That should have been 1904. It should have been way long before this. But look at this, 1985. First female police chief. You know my friend who I told you was pregnant? She was the first detective lieutenant for the state of Massachusetts. Our very good friend, her classmate, Marion McGovern, became in charge of the state police in the late 2000s. We're moving. We're moving right along, and I hope that you do as well. If you have any questions, feel free to call me. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.